is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of Government at Cornell University, author of The Government-Citizen Disconnect, Suzanne Mettler. Welcome to the program.
Great, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, let's now we last time we spoke, I think, was for at least on this program, was for your book entitled "The Submerged State," which similarly themed in terms of people's relationship to government, both in terms of like their perspective of government and their sort of material relationship with government. Just tell us first what the study that the Government-Citizen Disconnect is based upon.
Right. Well, when I wrote the book, The Submerged State, I was looking particularly at public policies that people use that are in the tax code. So, for example, the home mortgage interest deduction and various social benefits through the tax code, and finding that people were just very unaware of those being social policies. But in this book, The Government-Citizen Disconnect, I took a broader look at the American welfare state generally. I looked at some, over 20 public policies that people use. Some of them are in the tax code, but most of them are not. Most of them are things that we think of from Social Security to unemployment insurance to Medicaid, food stamps, et cetera. And I wanted to get a bird's eye view of who uses these policies and how many policies people are using, and then how that relates to people's attitudes about government broadly understood. So that's what I was up to.
Well, you don't have to list all 21, but how obscure are some of these programs that impact people?
The 21 policies are not obscure. There are, longer lists of policies that, various data sets look at that are pretty obscure. But I think that most Americans would recognize a lot of these policies as ones that either they themselves have used or they know someone who's used these policies. So, we're thinking of things that range from student loans to Pell Grants to the policies in the tax code that help people to afford going to college. For health care, it's Medicare and Medicaid, and employer-provided tax-exempt benefits that, those are a public policy because people don't have to pay taxes on them. Government subsidizes them. And retirement benefits such as Social Security, food aid in terms of the SNAP program, what we used to call food stamps, unemployment insurance, and so on.
Okay. And so and then once all right, well, tell us about how you've been tracking those for a long time, and there was, I guess, an element about the size of these that surprised you when you returned to them, and of course that sort of lays the first foundation or building block of this sort of large paradox that really is at the heart of what you call the government-citizen disconnect.
That's right. Yeah. So, I've been tracking the use of these policies historically. And I came across an interesting data set from the federal government, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, that looks at really just the more visible policies. It doesn't even include the ones that I call the submerged state. And if you look at Americans, the percentage of the average person's income that comes from these federal social benefits over time, it's grown dramatically. So if you go back to 1969, 7% of the average American's income came from federal social transfers or benefits. Now, most recently in 2014, it's up to 17%. And it's been a gradual increase over time. And of course, what that percentage is varies from place to place, from state to state, from county to county. But it's grown everywhere. And I was really fascinated to see this. I mean, if you delve in at the county level, you'll find that, of course, it's highest at some places like Appalachia, counties in Kentucky, for example, that were using it at higher rates way back when, but they're using a lot more now. But it's also increased in the wealthiest counties in the country. And so however you look at federal social benefits, the extent to which Americans rely upon them the extent to which Americans rely upon them has increased dramatically all over the country and in individuals' lives. And I found this to be true when you look at Americans in all sorts of different ways, by what party affiliation they have, by what income group they're part of, and so on. But the paradox is that at the same time, people's attitudes about government have become much worse. Most Americans back in the middle of the 20th century had pretty favorable views about government in terms of they trusted in government, they felt government was responsive to people like them, and those attitudes have deteriorated over the past several decades. So the puzzle to me is, how can these two things go together? That people are both distrusting government, they're not confident in it, and yet they rely upon it more than ever for their everyday lives and for health and education, retirement, et cetera.
Now, is it basically these changes that have occurred in terms of both the increased reliance on government support and the growing, I guess, distrust of government? I mean, and we haven't quite established necessarily that they're related. I mean, they could be, but one would, I guess, it's counterintuitive. One would assume that your perspective of government, the more you rely on it, would go up. There's no across all different cohorts. Is it more or less the same, the trajectory of both those phenomena?
Across different cohorts,
In other words, like for there's no difference in terms of class. There's no difference in terms of race, in terms of gender.
Yeah. Well, no, I did all sorts of analysis to look at this. And yeah, it is the case that Americans generally have now much worse attitudes about government than they used to. I mean, now it's only about 1 in 5 Americans who will say that they trust the government to do, they trust federal government in Washington to do what is right most of the time, and that they feel government is responsive to people like them, and so on. It used to be well over 60% or 70% on these different indicators, and so that's really widespread. But when I look at what causes these low levels of confidence in government, what I found is that people's public policy usage does not have much to do with it. So, I would have thought going in that it would, that if people were relying more on government, that it would give them more positive views about it. And it really doesn't make much difference. If people are using policies in the tax code, it does not even make a dent on their views about government. If they're using policies where government's role is more apparent, for those who use means-tested policies, they are appreciative of government's role, and on some indicators such as government has helped me in times of need, or government has provided opportunities for me to improve my standard of living, those individuals who've used more of those types of policies do have more favorable views of government. But aside from that, use of these policies makes very little difference. So then the question is, what does affect people's attitudes about government? And what I found, I looked at this in all sorts of different ways, and I controlled for all kinds of different factors. There was one thing that was highly significant again and again, and what that was people's attitudes about welfare. So people who have very unfavorable views of welfare, whatever that means to them, have in turn very negative attitudes about government. And it was very clear and very consistent. And let me just say that, this is sort of striking to me as a scholar of social policy to begin with, because what we used to call welfare was one program, and that was aid to families with dependent children.
Right.
And there was a big war against AFDC for decades, really, in the latter 20th century, and it was finally terminated in 1996. And it was replaced by a more restrictive program, temporary assistance to needy families. Today, less than 1% of the American public is using that program at any point in time. So it's a tiny number of people. I mean, the program was welfare as we knew it, to use a phrase Bill Clinton had used, is nearly gone. And yet, the American public today is still very anti-welfare, and it drives their views about government. So, what is that about? It seems that that it's, you could think of it as it's the boogeyman, that people associate something with that's much broader, and they're attaching it to more programs. But what I found when I looked at what are the determinants of those views, who feels that way, who's so anti-government, and it's about, by the way, about 44% of the American public has unfavorable views of welfare. What I found was that there were two things going on. One is that there does seem to be a racial bias. Whites are much more likely than people of color to have negative views about welfare. But in addition to that, and that's actually, many other scholars have found that to be the case in the past. But what I found in addition was that income group mattered a lot. So I divided up the people I was studying into all of these smaller groups. I found that all of the groups in the middle class had much more negative attitudes about welfare than people who were less well off than themselves, and people who were higher income did not have significantly different views than low-income people on welfare either. So it was really the middle-income groups.
Can you give us a sense?
People in households from 35,000 to 100,000, very negative attitudes about welfare.
What do you? I mean, what accounts for that? I mean,
what's going on there? Well, what I think is that for middle-income people, the past several decades have been difficult times where they have seen declining opportunities. They're working harder than ever. We know that Americans' productivity is very high, and yet there have been stagnating wages for individuals in the middle class throughout those decades, and they have not felt that government is really being responsive to them. And so, you have more and more people getting across those decades who were getting jobs that did not come with benefits, didn't come with health care, for example. College tuition for their kids was becoming more difficult to afford, and government was doing less to help them afford it, and so on. So I think, it's not surprising that people would feel more resentful. But the dynamic that's happening there is that people are, in a sense, blaming those who are worse off than themselves, thinking of them as undeserving. Some people in interviews that we did for the project told us that they felt that when they'd gotten into a slightly higher income group, then they no longer qualified for some benefits that they had when they were lower income. And so they were resentful about that. So, I think you have this combination of dynamics going on that have to do with both income as well as race.
Has that been consistent?
What's striking?
I'm sorry. Has that been? Go ahead.
And then what's striking is that it determines not only attitudes about welfare, but in turn that shapes broader views about government.
Right. I mean, that is. Has that been a consistent? I mean, has that level of resentment about welfare? Maybe not that it turns into resentment of government, but has that dynamic of resentment about welfare, has that been fairly consistent? I mean, there's so many, the tough part about this, right, is that all of these phenomena in some way line up. We've had 40 some odd years of 45 maybe now, some odd years of declining wages, of declining unionism,
Right.
of an increase in maybe reliance on government, but also just coincidentally, 40 some odd years, 45 years ago was basically when we had the Civil Rights Act and we had the Voting Rights Act, and there
Right.
was sort of a realignment of parties. And I mean, so it's hard to disaggregate all these things, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, that's true. And I would love to be able to answer your question about, do these welfare attitudes, have they been consistent over time? And I don't know the answer to that. In fact, it's something I'm planning to look at, but I don't yet know.
Okay, well, good. That will give us another reason to talk in the future. But all right, so but what is clear is that we have seen these at the very least fairly consistency over the past couple of decades. We've seen a sort of a side eye at towards welfare, which really, in some respects, doesn't exist in the way that people presume it does. And that
Right.
is a means or a vehicle for a growing mistrust of government. I mean, I think, like, from my perspective, there is at least one party that has been sort of actively, driving that, right? I mean, Ronald Reagan was talking about the welfare queen, and
That's right.
so
That's right.
so okay. So with that being the case, that growing, what's fascinating about your work here is that growing resentment comes almost in inverse proportion in some respects to how much these same people are probably relying on government themselves.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
All right. Well, so tell us about the theory of policy feedback and how that is implicated in this.
Yeah. So policy feedback is a term that political scientists use, and what we mean is that policies, once they're created, can have effects that were never planned or intended by policymakers that reshape politics. So, for example, Andrea Campbell at MIT did a wonderful study of Social Security and Medicare. And, of course, the goal of it was to provide the goal of Social Security was to provide for, initially, just for retirement of people who were beneficiaries. But she found that it also had political consequences, that those senior citizens, in turn, became more politically active. And they were becoming active in order to protect their benefits. And so that was a policy feedback dynamic, right? That's sort of a classic example of it. So I wondered in doing this study whether policies would also shape people's attitudes about government more broadly. And what I found in a nutshell is not really. They don't seem to have much impact on people's broader attitudes about government. I think that's because people don't necessarily connect those dots. They don't think, oh, here I am, with a substantial part of my income coming from these government policies. Therefore, it must be that public officials actually are trying to represent people like me and so on. People don't make those connections unless someone helps them to do so. Some organization that they're part of, such as the AARP or labor unions, for example, and there's much less of that happening than existed in the past. So I don't really find that kind of policy feedback dynamic. So the irony is that over these many decades, as you were saying, conservatives have been on a war against the welfare state really since around 1980, and they have not succeeded. I mean, this is very interesting. I mean, there's only one major program that was decimated, and that was, as I said, AFPC. But at the same time, people's attitudes about government broadly have been undermined over these same time periods. And I don't think that was conservatives' initial goal. So, we're now at a point in time where people are extremely skeptical of any kind of activity that government engages in, even though they're still using all of these policies of the welfare state. So it's a paradoxical outcome.
Okay, a couple of things. Let me just start with let me go backwards. In terms of that being the conservatives' goal, I mean, if it wasn't their goal, it feels like they certainly have embraced that that perspective of just broadly attacking the idea of government, right? I mean, even I'm just thinking of again Reagan. When the government is an obstacle, right? I mean, it's the way that they provide an assault on the regulatory state but this you're suggesting that this was a twofer for them, attack welfare and also undermine people's perspective on government.
I think that conservatives wanted to scale back the welfare state, and I think that you're right. They also wanted to scale back regulatory policies. I don't think that they wanted people to move to fundamental distrust of anything that government does, and to move to a point where they're questioning basic principles of American government and norms that have been longstanding norms about how government operates in the United States, about civil liberties and civil rights, about freedom of the press, etc.
All right.
So well, I think it got somewhat out of hand.
All right. I mean, I would agree with that. And that I don't think is necessarily material to what we're talking about, because I'm a little bit more jaundiced about that. But putting that aside for a moment, I'm also really interested in this dynamic of Social Security had elderly people more invested in politics and in government, and it activated them. And you suggested this was a function of maybe like an organization like AARP that gave them sort of an outlet to do this, and that unions served a similar function, because it is well established that folks who receive, let's say, Medicaid tend not to be politically engaged. And I wonder if the explanation of this is not just that elderly folks or retired folks had the AARP, and that unions had the union members had the union, but that also Medicaid people who receive Medicaid by and large are still under a tremendous amount of financial anxiety, pressure, deprivation, versus someone in a union or someone who is getting Social Security, because the Social Security actually, relative to what's on your plate, Social Security takes care of you, gives you a baseline that you can't fall through. Whereas something like Medicaid, let's say, or even, the temporary assistance, TANF, that we now have, it seems to me to be a lot less, provide you a lot less room to get politically active. You still have a tremendous amount to do to make sure that your kids eat, or that you have a roof to live over. I mean, could it simply be not just a function of having a mechanism to express political, activity, but also just like that's a certain, not quite a luxury, but it's like,
yes, no, you're absolutely right. So, I was mentioning that people who use many of these means-tested visible policies, like Medicaid, for example, food stamps, et cetera, tend to be quite appreciative of them. And I also found that those same individuals are in favor of more expanded social benefits for the population generally. But here's the rub: they actually participate less in politics. They're much less likely to vote, and they're much less likely to participate in all kinds of other activities than people who have used other kinds of policies. And what does that relate to? It relates to the fact that, as you're saying, their lives are really complicated, and they, for all of the political scientists have a large, long-standing literature about who participates in politics and who participates less. And there are several factors that work against the activity of those individuals. The fact that they're likely to be very poor, and to have very little leisure time, et cetera. So it's not surprising that they participate less. But what this means, I found, is that there is a participatory tilt. The people who participate most in politics are those who they do use social benefits, just like all other Americans. All Americans are using plenty of social benefits. But the people who participate most tend to use ones that they're least aware of, policies that are hidden in the tax code, like the home mortgage interest deduction and so on. And so they are less likely to be participating and thinking about government as being a useful and positive force in society. They're more likely to have anti-government attitudes.
Right, because on some level, the support that they're getting from the government is allows them to, it allows them almost like the luxury side of their life. Right? Like, if you get a big mortgage deduction on a massive house. If you're 529 now, you can save money for your private school without taxes. I mean, this is a perfect example of just like you're getting upgraded to business or first class because of government support, as opposed to it's just getting you on the plane in economy.
That's right. And, let me clarify that if a lot of people were listening right now, whether and they themselves are using those policies, the reaction that many people have is, wait a minute, that's my own money. And that means that government is taking less of my money than it would otherwise, if these policies are in the tax code. What I want to point out is that they are social benefits, just like the more visible type. So take, for example, how we deal with housing. For a low-income person, we provide housing subsidies. For a person who can afford a house with a mortgage, we allow them to pay less in taxes. From an accounting perspective, it doesn't matter whether we're sending someone a check or whether we are allowing them to pay less in taxes. Either way, there's less money in the federal treasury. Or think of it as, people of the same income group, and one of them rents and the other one has a house with a mortgage. We give the benefit to the person with a house with a mortgage. We give nothing to the person who's renting. And so it is a special benefit that we're giving to those individuals. But because of the way it's delivered through the tax code, people don't see it as such.
That's right. I mean, the government is picking winners and losers in this situation.
Exactly.
And,
that's right.
And so let's talk about you focus on you do a little bit of geographic focusing and a little bit in terms of policy. I mean, briefly, let's talk about Kentucky and then the earned income tax credit. I mean, we've covered some of this stuff, but Kentucky is a particularly interesting case that you look at.
It is, yeah. So Kentucky is a poor state. There's a lot of poverty there, and there long has been. If you go back to 1970, 10% of the average Kentuckian's income came from federal social transfers. And by 2015, that was up to 23%. But at the same time, things changed politically in Kentucky. So Kentucky used to send mostly Democrats to Congress, and most of them were moderate Democrats, and some of them on social policies were quite progressive. For example, Carl Perkins came from Kentucky and was the champion of a major higher education policy that helped low-income students. By the time we get to the early 1990s, Kentucky was changing and beginning to send moderate Republicans to Congress. And then by the mid-1990s to the present, those Republicans became more and more conservative, members of the Freedom Caucus over time. And so you have now members from Kentucky who are saying, we should have work requirements on food stamps. And yet a very high percentage of their own constituents are using these same public policies. So it sort of illustrates that paradox.
And again, is that a function of the the folks who are using at least a big chunk of those services are just not active in terms of in terms of politics, and the ones who are using the sort of the high end benefits are.
That participatory tilt is part of the explanation. But then it's also the case that, I was saying that today we don't really have organizations and political leaders who are effectively connecting the dots for people about their use of policies and what government's doing for them. But other folks are connecting dots for people in Kentucky, and the dots they're connecting are they're saying, these environmental policies that Democrats have been promoting, that's the reason why the economy is doing badly in Kentucky. That's why we're losing jobs in coal mining, for example. Now, if you drill down, there's not good evidence for those claims. Coal mining jobs have been leaving Kentucky since, middle of the 20th century for all sorts of reasons that don't have to do with public policy. But that story that conservatives have been telling has convinced people. And so they vote accordingly, and they're more focused on those issues than on social benefits.
All right. So earned income credit. Just explain to people what that is, because I'm not sure that people fully understand this policy. And we should say this is a policy that was pushed back when there was some broad agreement that we should try and provide a social safety net. The earned income tax credit was sort of the Republican favored way of providing that safety net.
Yeah, both Republicans and conservative Democrats really championed the earned income tax credit, really beginning in the 1970s onward, and it became expanded during the Clinton years and more recently. And this is today our most effective anti-poverty policy that we have in the United States, and it's channeled through the tax code, and it's for people who could be called the working poor. They work, but they make very low wages. And so government supplements that with extra funds that people receive when they file their taxes. So it's very effective from a social and economic point of view, but I wanted to know what impact it had politically on people's attitudes about government. And what I found is that it really doesn't make a dent, that people who receive it, they don't think of government as doing anything for them. In fact, these tend to be individuals who have very negative attitudes about government. And, probably for a lot of reasons that are not surprising. Life has been hard for them, and they don't feel that government has helped much. But when they receive the EITC, they tend to experience it as coming from their own work effort. And this is even if they have no tax liability themselves. They don't see government giving them something. It's also a matter of how it's delivered. So a lot of people, in order to claim the EITC, they go to H&R Block, for example, which fills out their forms for them and files them, and then they get the benefit. They like it that they don't have to go to a welfare office to receive these benefits. And yet what that means is, because they're not going to some kind of a government office, that government's role is just invisible.
So, explain to people how this is calculated. So, like, for instance, if you are a single worker, you're making about $45,000 a year. Let's say you have two children. You're going to get back, about $5,000 or $6,000, right? Maybe, 11%, 12%.
Yeah.
What is that money represent? How do they determine that? Is that just a function of like money that you have paid in terms of like payroll taxes, or that they're just going to give you back, or what is that exactly? Or is that money that you never paid in taxes?
So it's calculated on the basis of how much the individual has been earning and how many dependents they have, for some people, they have been paying some income taxes, and then they're getting money back on top of that. For some individuals, they actually owe nothing because they're low enough income, and they get a check from government, which is the EITC, so they have no tax liability, and they're getting a benefit.
So just to be clear, these are people who, in Mitt Romney's words, right, when he's in his secret fundraising meetings, these are the 47% of takers. The vast majority of these people are those people. And yet, they don't see themselves as those people.
I have trouble answering that question because Romney was wrong in so many ways with the 47% comment.
Right.
But the larger point you're making is correct, right? Though I would point out that, everyone is paying Social Security taxes if they're working. So even if they're not paying federal income taxes, they're paying FICA taxes.
Right. That's where they go to once you get specific with them. About that question. All right. Well, so with all this said, and this is the dynamic laid out. What do we do? Like, I mean, this is not a good situation where that the policies that we have end up undercutting support for the policies that we have that help people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is designing policies differently, but at the moment, we're not about to do that because of all sorts of things that are going on in politics. But what we can do more quickly is begin to connect the dots for ourselves, for our families, for our organizations, for our communities. I mean, that's what conservatives have mastered, and they've been doing that over many decades. And I think that other people have kind of, stopped doing it. And so that's where you have this disconnect in people's actual circumstances and the extent to which they rely on government social benefits and their views about government, because they're not connecting those dots about the extent to which they actually use various benefits. So I think that organizations need to do this with their members. I think we need to that people who are running for office and elected officials need to make much more of a point of talking about benefits in these specific kinds of ways. We find that when Americans' attention is drawn to vague terms like about the size of government and taxes, and I would add to that list welfare. These are highly symbolic terms, and they immediately make Americans respond in ways where they seem quite conservative. But if you talk to people about specific policy benefits that lots of people have utilized, like unemployment insurance and Social Security and so on, people are very supportive of these programs. And so if we put more attention on these specific things that government does rather than on the vague terms about it, then I think you have very different responses.
What about if we have a world where we can actually refashion policy? I mean, and certainly, I mean, I think we can go around and try and message what exists better. But I keep thinking about that dynamic of why people protect Social Security more and why, and I can't help but think that it's because it provides enough for them that they can afford to actually engage in politics.
Yes, that is true. And low-income people who are Social Security beneficiaries are much more active in politics than we would predict on the basis of their income group. And you're right, because Social Security gives them the capacity to do that.
So is the answer essentially to, when we get into a position where where policies could actually change, is to make things more universal and frankly more generous?
Well, ideally, yes, we would make things more universal and more generous, but we can start out by making them more visible. so that people are at least aware of what government is already doing, and that it's coming from government, that it's not just coming from the private sector or from their own efforts. And so, simple things about how policies are delivered can make that difference, I think.
Suzanne Mettler, the Government Citizen Disconnect. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.